What happened to One Piece's art style? People will say how the manga used to look so much better, but before One Piece looked like this, it looked like this. Which raises the question, was the art in One Piece really better before the time skip? That's why I went back, reread everything up through the Paramount War, and made a list of every artistic change Oda made in early One Piece. Now, before I share that list, I should make a couple of disclaimers. First of all, since we're talking about changes Oda made, this video will not cover anything relating to the anime. Second, as this will cover more than 60 volumes, be warned that this video might contain some spoilers. With those out of the way, let's get into the first of 3 stages in early One Piece's art. Beginning with Romance Dawn, the first stage lasts right until Baroque works. Now, the biggest difference between the art now and the art in this stage is, of course, characters. In East Blue, character designs are relatively toned down. While designs in One Piece are usually pretty goofy, in this stage I wouldn't really call them cartoonish. If anything, I think the only word you can use to describe them is just simple. For example, let's take a look at Luffy in Chapter 3. In this page, Luffy's design is actually somewhat normal. You'll notice that he's got arms and legs with no real definition. His shorts have the cutoffs and some wrinkles, but that's it. His shirt almost has no detail. Were it not for the 3 buttons, it would just look like a floating polygon. And then of course you have his iconic face, which is famous for the simple eyes, nose, and mouth, and not much else. Then you look at his hands and the same is true as well. His hands are just sorta drawn as is in a simple, unremarkable way. You can tell just by the way Oda draws a closed fist with stubby circles signaling the wrapped up fingers as opposed to more detailed fingers. So as you can see, in this stage, characters aren't really cartoonish per se. It isn't until later that they're drawn with a bit more personality. In this stage, they're pretty toned down. And for the sake of argument, let's take a look at the art of Oda's contemporary and past co-worker, Hiroyuki Takei. When Takei started his manga Shaman King, it was much more cartoonish than what Oda was making. So if you compare early Luffy to early Yo, you can see how with Luffy everything is relatively toned down, whereas with Yo all the shapes and proportions are pretty exaggerated. I just wanted to make that quick comparison since it does give you a helpful sense of perspective. Now for the most part, Oda's designs in general are pretty toned down as well. So for example, if we look at this spread from chapter 13, we can see the early designs for Luffy, Zoro, and Nami. Now obviously they do look different, but relatively speaking they all look fairly similar. Their hands look the same, their body proportions aren't all that different. The only real differences besides their outfits are their faces. So in general, East Blue character designs are pretty simple, and for this reason, they don't have as much personality as they would later on. And this theme carries into other elements of the art style as well. But before I get into that, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. Now, another simple aspect of the art at this stage is backgrounds. At least in early One Piece, Oda doesn't stylize objects and scenery all that much. When you take a careful look at how he draws backgrounds, they're sort of drawn more as is, as opposed to something like, say, Black Clover, where Tabata makes the scenery match the fantasy aesthetic. In One Piece, Oda does give backgrounds a somewhat cartoonish look that you can see in certain details like the lettering on signs. But for the most part, like the character designs, Oda has a very simple approach to backgrounds. On a similar note, Oda also has a simple approach when it comes to paneling. In general, Oda's art style is pretty similar to a lot of the older manga that came before One Piece. But the one aspect you see this the most in is in paneling, especially in East Blue. Oda's paneling is very predictable. If it's a fight, you can expect somewhat more dynamic paneling with some panels clashing. But for everything else, it's just a whole lot of squares and rectangles. This does change a bit later on, but in East Blue, it's very conventional. On the one hand, Oda does it in a way where it makes everything easy to follow, but on the other hand, it does leave you kind of wanting more. Now, where I would argue Oda makes up for this is actually in the area of onomatopoeias. Like a lot of older manga, One Piece has a lot of onomatopoeias, but Oda heavily leans into it with some of the lettering taking up entire panels. Where in some manga it's more of a subtle accent, in One Piece it kinda makes the panel. Like, you look at this panel of Zoro when he gets introduced, and besides the letters, it would otherwise be completely blank, but you have these massive letters that stand out almost more than Zoro. You can also see it a lot in the action. For example, you have this panel when Zoro takes down the two brothers. Now, besides the already visceral action, you have the onomatopoeia, which adds to the sense that Zoro is slashing right through these guys as it kind of fills in the trail that Zoro leaves behind. And on the topic of action, it's worth noting that this is one of Oda's stronger points in early One Piece. In a style similar to Dragon Ball, Oda's simple designs are complemented by intense action. For example, while I'm not a big fan of Don Krieg, I loved this panel from the fight. Everything comes together perfectly in this panel. You see how Luffy is throwing all of his energy into the attack. You see Don Krieg completely wiped out, showing the physical reaction to Luffy's attack. And then Oda combines rubble and a bunch of other stuff flying in all different directions to show just how explosive the attack is. He even draws the letters in a messy array to show that Luffy's attack is almost breaking the fourth wall. So while we do have simple designs, in a way, they allow Oda to put a ton of emphasis on amazing action scenes like this one, and it only gets better in the next stage. But before I move on, there's a couple more things worth noting. First of all, most people will notice the thick line work. And I don't just mean thick. I mean like very broad outlines and painfully clear details. You can make whatever argument you want for this, but personally, I just think it makes One Piece's art style that much more visually pleasing. And on a similar note, there aren't a ton of grays in this stage. As you'll probably notice, it's mostly black and white, further reinforcing the simple aesthetic of East Blue. But on that note, let's move on to stage 2. The second stage starts with Baroque works and lasts right through Skypiea. Now, the first thing I'd like to talk about is actually the paneling. People like to talk about Oda's paneling in the recent chapters and say, oh, One Piece fell off. But look at pages like this one. This isn't something in later One Piece. It's not even New Worlds. This is going back all the way to chapter 181. Granted, it's really not that bad, but you'll notice that this style of paneling didn't randomly pop up out of nowhere. This is something Oda's been doing for almost 1,000 chapters. For example, you fast forward to Skypiea and you get pages like this one. Now, none of these panels on their own are bad, but you look at the page as a whole and it's a mess. Ideally, panels should be structured in such a way that the reader is naturally led across the intended course of the page. But I'm guessing most people have to look at this page a couple of times the first time they look at it. It's hard to follow, and quite frankly, it just doesn't look good. There are times where Oda actually makes this thing kind of work. For example, you have this page where Luffy is fighting Crocodile. This one is a mix because on the one hand it is kind of similar to that messy style, but on the other hand, a page like this isn't really that different from something you would see in other manga. In any event, this is where Oda starts to get fairly messy with the paneling and it doesn't really go away. But as you just saw, obviously this doesn't hinder the action. As a matter of fact, action gets even better in this stage. So for example, let's go back to Alabasta. Look at this page where Luffy kicks Crocodile square in the face. It's full of detail, and you can just feel the impact as soon as you look at it. But now let's contrast that with this panel from Arlong Park. And right away you can tell the difference. In this panel with Arlong, it does look good, but comparatively speaking, it does seem a bit flat. And the reason for this is that in the Arlong Park panel, Oda puts all the emphasis on the impact. But in the Crocodile panel, everything is detailed. You can see the ripples in Crocodile's face, the way even his hair is impacted. You get this aggressive blurred style of Luffy's body, further emphasizing the speed and power behind the kick. So you can tell that as One Piece goes on, Oda adds more detail to the fight scenes. And while I would love to belabor the point, I'd rather just show you a couple more panels to at least show how good the action is in early One Piece. Surprisingly, one fight that stands out the most from Alabasta is Nami's. This panel of her using Thunderbolt Tempo is full of energy, pun not intended. One other panel I have to mention is Luffy versus Bellamy. While it does look good in the anime, it looks phenomenal in the manga. Now, in addition to the action, character designs also improve. And for this one, let's take a look at Nami. Okay, so here's Nami from East Blue. Now here's Nami from a color spread in Jaya. The differences don't jump out right away, but when you look carefully, you can see the changes. First, you'll notice that the proportions are more exaggerated. So here, the waist is much narrower. As a matter of fact, her shoulders are even a bit wider. Not bigger, just wider. And most notably, her head is bigger. For whatever reason, Oda draws faces in a way where the top of the heads are much bigger than the rest of the face. Like if we take this page from chapter 225, you can see how Nami's head is almost twice the size of her face by comparison. I can't say for certain why Oda did this, but I can say that by doing so, it brings more attention to the faces of characters. So before, heads looked pretty tiny, so they blended in with the overall design. But once they get bigger, you notice the face a lot more, even when you get a complete profile of the character. Incidentally, it's this stage where Oda hits his true, what I would tend to call caricature-esque style of character designs. Before, they were just simple, but now Oda finds his true style and really exaggerates the designs. So for example, one crazy character I can think of from East Blue is Morgan. And yeah, he is a pretty crazy looking character. But now let's stand him side by side with Dalton. Morgan is a bit wackier in design, but when you look at the features of each character, Dalton's has a lot more personality. Oda really exaggerates the shoulders and pure size of Dalton, expressing much more about the character than in Morgan's design. You can also see this in the way he draws Wiper, who is still one of the most underrated characters in One Piece. Now at first glance, he might not look as wacky as other characters, but really look at his musculature. He has a huge neck. His chest does look big, but it's dwarfed by his massive abs. I mean, this dude's torso is like pure abs and chest. Again, goofy for sure, but much more personality in designs than we were getting before. Thankfully, Oda does find a way to balance things out as the story goes on. But before I get into that, I do have one final thought on this stage. As you've probably noticed, line work in this stage isn't nearly as thick as before. And while it may not be as visually satisfying for some, as you can see, it does allow Oda to focus on other details. Plus, whereas East Blue looks much more black and white, the slightly thinner line work helps to alleviate that, giving a more balanced sense of grays. But on that note, let's move on to the final stage of early One Piece. The third stage starts with Water 7 and lasts right until the time skip before we enter the current era of One Piece. Now, unlike the prior stages, there aren't a ton of changes in this stage. As far as I can see, there's really only two. First, like I mentioned, Oda finds some balance in the designs. So in East Blue, they were really simple. Then in stage 2, he would draw characters like caricatures. But after Skypiea, he tones down the designs while retaining the same personality. In general, he does this by giving the characters slightly longer faces. So you look at panels of, say, Luffy or Nami, and while they still have big heads, Oda draws out the chins a bit more, making the head more circular instead of these goofy egg shapes. Granted, Oda does still do a lot of crazy designs. I couldn't help but notice that for the Zoan designs for CP9, Oda was obsessed with drawing these characters with absurdly big backs and noses. But generally speaking, character designs are slightly less exaggerated than the prior stage. Finally, Oda continues in the trend of messy paneling, with it arguably getting worse. Like for example, when you go back and look at the Paramount War, a lot of it is very similar to a lot of the pages people criticized in Wano. And this is what a lot of people consider the peak of One Piece. Yet just looking at it, you can tell it didn't really improve. I will say this isn't a constant issue. Like in the prior stage, it was really only when you had a ton of fights going on, but then the paneling would go back to normal. And the same is true here. The only problem is when it does get messy, it is really hard to follow and at some points just looks plain bad. But obviously not so bad to ruin the story, as it would go on for another 50 plus volumes. So on that note, I think we can finally answer our original question. Namely, is the art in early One Piece that much better than the current stuff? And while I would like to reserve my final opinion until after I revisit Fishman Island and the other arcs after the time skip, for now I think I can safely say that the art peaked in early One Piece. In which arc, I can't say for sure, but there's a couple of reasons I feel this way. First of all, the designs. Like I said, Oda really found his stride in Alabasta and onward. I just think his goofy approach to designs give them so much more personality in ways that readers will remember random side characters from 600 chapters ago. It just makes the world of One Piece truly special. Second, as you can probably guess, is the messy paneling. While it is present in early One Piece, it isn't until the Paramount War where it starts to get out of hand. So for this reason, early One Piece chapters just flow better, particularly prior to Water 7. So for those reasons, I feel like the art style is slightly better prior to the time skip. But regardless of whether it peaked, there's a bunch of things Oda established in early One Piece that are still present today. One of which is the action. Say what you will about the paneling, but the action is still gorgeous in One Piece, whether it be Dressrosa, Whole Cake, or Wano. Another thing that honestly stands out the most is character expression. I mean, if I asked you to name iconic anime scenes, like 50 of them would all be One Piece. I mean, there's a range of expressions from Robin declaring she wants to live, to Nami asking Luffy for help, and then, of course, Enel's epic reaction face. So regardless of where you stand on the whole old versus new thing, I think we can all agree that early One Piece has a charm that everyone will always love. But now I'd like to hear what you think. How would you compare One Piece to other art styles? How would you describe One Piece's art style? Share your thoughts in the comments down below and see what everyone else has to say. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another discussion like this one, then check out my video on Jujutsu Kaisen. In that video, I analyzed the artistic evolution of Jujutsu Kaisen. You can find that video in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.